Hello, my dear friends and fellow travelers. Welcome back to another evening of shared stories and wonders from the ancient world. Tonight, we journey far beyond the borders of familiar lands, back through the mists of time to the elder days of Middle-earth, to a time when the world was young and the stars were new. We're going to explore something dark, something twisted, yet something utterly essential to understanding the great tales of that legendary age. Tonight, we speak of orcs. Now, before you settle too deeply into your blankets, let me assure you that while our subject is grim, our journey will be one of understanding and wonder. For even in darkness there are lessons to learn, and even in the most terrible of creations there is a story worth telling. So grab your mug of something warm, pull your favorite quilt a little closer, and let us begin at the very beginning, before there were any orcs at all, when the world itself was being sung into existence. Picture, if you will, a time beyond memory, a time when the earth was formless and new, when the great powers of the world, the Valar, walked openly upon the lands and shaped them with their mighty hands. These were beings of immense power and wisdom, servants of the One, the creator of all things. They were like gods to the peoples who would come later, and they loved the world they were making with a deep and abiding passion. Chief among the Valar was one called Melkor, though he would later be known by a darker name, Morgoth, the black foe of the world. But in those early days, Melkor was the mightiest of all the Valar, gifted with a portion of the power of each of his brothers and sisters. He was meant to be the greatest among them, the first and most glorious, and perhaps it was this very greatness that became his downfall. You see, Melkor began to desire not to serve the great plan, but to have power of his own. He wished to create, to command, to rule. And when he could not create a life, could not bring forth beings of his own from nothingness, as the One alone could do, Melkor grew bitter. He grew jealous, and that jealousy festered in his heart like a wound that would not heal. In those days, the world was lit not by the sun and moon as we know them, but by two great lamps that the Valar had made. These lamps stood in the north and south, and their light was clear and beautiful, illuminating all the lands between. Under their light, the earth began to flourish. Green things grew, waters flowed pure and clean. The Valar made themselves dwelling places and gardens of surpassing beauty, and for a time all was well. But Melkor, in his pride and his jealousy, could not bear to see such beauty that he had not made himself. In secret, in the far north of the world, he built himself a fortress, a terrible place of dungeons and dark halls, deep beneath the mountains in a land of eternal ice. This fortress was called Utumno, and it was there that Melkor began his long work of corruption and ruin. From Utumno, he sent forth his power to blight and twist the growing things of the earth, to poison waters and tear down what the other Valar had built. Eventually, the other Valar discovered what Melkor had been doing, and there was war. A terrible war that shook the foundations of the world. The great lamps were thrown down and broken, and their fall created vast devastation. The shape of the lands was changed. The Valar, grieving for the harm done to the world, withdrew to the far west, to a land called Valinor, which they fortified and made beautiful beyond measure. There they dwelt, and there they kindled new lights, the two trees whose radiance was even more beautiful than the lamps had been. But here is the thing you must understand. When the Valar went west to Valinor, they left Middle-earth, the great lands in the center of the world, in twilight. There was no sun yet, remember, no moon, only the ancient stars that had been kindled in the sky by Vada, the queen of the stars in the ages before. And it was under these stars, in this time of twilight and shadow, that the first children of the One awoke, the elves. Oh, the elves. The firstborn they were called, and they were beautiful beyond the telling of it. Tall and fair, with voices like music and eyes that reflected the starlight. They awoke beside a lake in the far east of Middle-earth, in a place called Cuivienen, the water of awakening, and they knew nothing of the great powers of the world, nothing of the Valar or of Melkor. They knew only the stars above them and the world around them, and they began to explore it with wonder and joy. But Melkor knew. Oh yes, Melkor, from his fortress in the north, became aware of the elves almost as soon as they awakened, and his black heart conceived a use for them, a terrible use. You see, the Valar had told Melkor in the days before he was cast down that the children of the One would come into the world, children that Melkor could not create, could not control, could not command. And this knowledge gnawed at him worse than anything else. These elves were not his, would never be his, could never truly belong to him. But Melkor was cunning as well as mighty, and he began to form a plan. The Valar, dwelling in their blessed realm in the west, eventually learned that the elves had awakened, and they were filled with joy, but also with concern, for they knew that Melkor still lurked in the north, and that Middle-earth was not safe. They debated long about what to do, and eventually they went to war again, this time with the explicit purpose of protecting the elves and putting an end to Melkor's power once and for all. This was the War of the Powers, and it was terrible beyond imagining. The Valar came with all their might and besieged Utumno. They broke its gates and cast down its towers and delved deep into its dungeons to find Melkor and drag him forth. And drag him forth they did, binding him with a chain that could not be broken, and taking him back to Valinor to face judgment for his crimes. But here is the tragedy that no one knew at the time. In the years before the Valar came, while the elves wandered in the starlight and began to spread across the lands, Melkor had been busy. His servants, spirits of shadow and flame that had followed him into darkness, had been sent out into the world with a terrible mission. They were to capture elves, to take them secretly, quietly, so that their disappearance would seem like nothing more than a wandering into far places from which they did not return. And capture them they did, in ones and twos at first, then in greater numbers as they grew bolder. Elves who strayed too far from their kindred, elves who were curious or brave or simply unlucky. They were taken into the darkness, dragged down into the pits of Utumno, and there, in those black dungeons beneath the earth, Melkor began his most terrible work. He could not create life, not truly, but he could mar it. He could twist it. He could corrupt and torment and break what already lived until it became something new, something hideous, something that served only him. And the elves, being the firstborn, being fair and strong and filled with the light of the stars, they were the perfect material for his dark crafting. The torment lasted years, perhaps decades, perhaps even longer. Time in those deep places was meaningless, measured only in suffering and despair. The captured elves were subjected to tortures beyond description, their bodies twisted, their minds broken, their spirits crushed beneath the weight of Melkor's malice. They were kept in darkness, starved and beaten, taught to hate the light that had once been their joy. They were bred like animals, their offspring born into the same darkness and taught only cruelty and obedience. And slowly, horribly, they changed. Their bodies grew crooked and bent. Their skin became rough and mottled, grey or green or sickly yellow. Their eyes, which had once reflected starlight, became yellow and red, glowing with malice in the dark. Their voices, once musical, became harsh and grating. They learned to love darkness and to fear the light. They learned to delight in causing pain because pain was all they had ever known. They forgot the stars, forgot beauty, forgot everything except hatred and fear and the iron will of their master. These were the first orcs. It is important to understand that this transformation was not willing. It was not a choice. The elves who were taken and twisted into orcs were victims, tragic victims of the greatest evil that had yet entered the world. They were made into monsters against their will, and in some deep place within them, buried beneath layers of corruption and torment, perhaps some spark of what they had been still remained. But if it did, it was so deeply buried that it could never be reached, never be healed, never be redeemed. By the time the Valar broke open Utumno and cast Melkor down, the damage was done. The first orcs already existed, lurking in the deepest pits of the fortress. And while many of Melkor's works were destroyed in that war, while many of his servants were slain or scattered, the orcs survived. They fled into dark holes and forgotten places, multiplying in the shadows, waiting. Melkor himself was taken to Valinor and imprisoned, but his creatures remained, and they would plague Middle-earth for all the ages to come, a living testament to his cruelty and his power to corrupt even the most beautiful of things. The Valar invited the elves to come west to Valinor, to dwell in the light of the two trees and be safe from whatever evils might still lurk in Middle-earth. Many went, traveling on a great journey that would become legendary in its own right. But some elves refused. They loved Middle-earth, loved the stars, loved their freedom to wander where they willed, and so they remained, and their fate would be intertwined with the orcs in ways neither could have foreseen. As for the orcs, they had no such choice. They were bound to darkness, bound to their master, even when he was far away. They were the first of many evils that would spring from Melkor's malice, but they were perhaps the most enduring. For while other creatures of his making might be greater or more terrible, the orcs were numerous, and they could breed, and they could survive without him. They were a corruption that had taken on a life of its own, and so the stage was set. The world had been marred. Darkness had been given form and shape and will, and in the ages to come, in all the great wars and terrible battles that would shake Middle-earth to its foundations, the orcs would be there, not as heroes or even as willing servants, but as the broken, twisted instruments of evil, forever bound to the darkness that had made them. But that is a story for the chapters to come, my friends. For now, let us pause here at the beginning of things, when the world was still young and the stars were bright. Let us remember that even in the darkest tales there is value in the telling. For to understand evil is to better recognize good, and to know how deeply the world was wounded is to appreciate all the more those who fought to heal it. Rest easy, dear listeners. Tomorrow we shall continue our journey into the shadows, and we shall learn more about what the orcs became and what role they played in the shaping of Middle-earth. But for tonight, let the knowledge we have gained settle gently into your thoughts, and may your dreams be peaceful and free from shadow. Sleep well, and I shall see you again soon. Welcome back, my dear friends. I hope you rested well after our first journey into the Elder Days. Tonight, we delve deeper into the darkness, but fear not. Though our subject remains grim, we walk this path together, and there is comfort in understanding even the most troubling of truths. So settle in once more, for we must speak of how the orcs truly came to be, and what they became in those first terrible years of their existence. When we left our tale, the Dark Lord Melkor had been captured and imprisoned by the Valar, dragged in chains to Valinor to answer for his crimes against the world. But his greatest crime, the twisting of the captured elves into the first orcs, had already been accomplished. And while Melkor himself languished in captivity, his creations remained in Middle-earth, multiplying in the shadows, growing in number and malice. Now you might wonder, as many scholars of later ages would wonder, exactly how this transformation occurred. How does one take a being of light and beauty, one of the firstborn children of creation, and turn them into something so fundamentally opposite to what they were? The answer, I'm afraid, lies in understanding the nature of corruption itself. Melkor, you see, was the mightiest of all the Valar, and his power was vast beyond mortal comprehension. But more than raw power, he possessed a cunning and a malice that knew no bounds. He understood that to truly mar something, you could not simply destroy it. No, destruction was too simple, too quick. To truly corrupt something, you had to take what was good and twist it, pervert it, turn it against itself, until it became a mockery of what it once was. The elves who were captured and brought into the darkness of Utumno were not simply tortured, though torture was certainly part of their ordeal. They were subjected to a systematic breaking down of everything that made them who they were. Their love of light was turned into a burning hatred of it through exposure and pain. Their natural grace and beauty were twisted through starvation, through forced labor in cramped and terrible conditions, through deliberate maiming and scarring. But the physical changes, horrible as they were not the worst of it. Melkor worked upon their minds and spirits as well. He filled them with lies, whispered constantly in the darkness. He told them they had been abandoned, that the Valar cared nothing for them, that the light they had loved was a lie meant to blind them to the truth. He fostered hatred and cruelty among them, rewarding those who turned on their fellows, who embraced the darkness, who learned to take pleasure in the pain of others. Generation by generation, the transformation deepened. The children born to these corrupted elves knew nothing but the darkness and the cruelty. They were raised in the pits, taught from their first breath that strength came from domination, that mercy was weakness, that the only law was the will of their master. And they grew twisted in both body and soul, becoming something that was no longer truly elvish, yet carried within them some terrible echo of what their ancestors had been. These were the Orcs, or as they would sometimes be called in the various languages of Middle-earth, goblins. Though the two names referred to the same wretched race, they were shorter than elves generally, though this varied. Some were squat and broad, built like barrels with long, powerful arms. Others were lean and wiry, all sinew and spite. Their skin was thick and rough, mottled in shades of grey, green, brown, and occasionally a sickly yellow. Their faces were flat and brutish, with wide mouths filled with sharp, uneven teeth. Their eyes glowed yellow or red in the darkness, adapted to seeing in the deepest pits where no light ever reached. They had developed a tolerance for pain that was almost inhuman, a necessary adaptation to the cruelty that governed their existence. They could survive on the most meager of rations, on food that would sicken other races. They bred quickly, far more quickly than elves ever did, producing offspring in numbers that could replace their losses in battle. This rapid breeding was another of Melkor's dark gifts to them, ensuring that his army would never run dry. The Orcs spoke in harsh, guttural languages that hurt the ear to hear. These tongues were deliberately ugly, reflecting the ugliness of their existence. Later, much later, the Dark Lord Sauron would create a single unified language for them, the Black Speech, which was designed to be even more hateful and terrible than their natural dialects. But in these early days, each tribe of Orcs had its own crude tongue, and they communicated between tribes in a debased form of the common speech, filling it with curses and threats. One of the most distinctive features of the Orcs was their relationship with light. They hated it with a passion that went beyond mere discomfort. Sunlight, when it eventually came into the world, would cause them actual pain, weakening them and making them sluggish and fearful. Even starlight, which their elvish ancestors had loved, now caused them distress. They were creatures of darkness, and in darkness they thrived. Their eyes, adapted to the absolute blackness of the deep pits, could see where others would be blind. They preferred to travel and fight at night, and when forced to move in daylight, they would cover themselves in heavy cloaks and move in misery and rage. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Orcs was their complete enslavement to the will of their master. They had no freedom, no choice, no ability to determine their own fate. Melkor, and later Sauron, and other dark powers controlled them utterly. The Orcs feared their masters with a terror that overshadowed even their hatred of the light. They would obey any command, no matter how suicidal, because the alternative, their master's wrath, was worse than any death in battle. This is not to say that Orcs were mindless. Far from it. They possessed a low cunning, a sort of cruel intelligence that made them dangerous opponents. They could set traps, plan ambushes, and employ tactics in battle. They were skilled, in their crude way, at forging weapons and armor, though their work was always ugly and brutal, designed for function rather than beauty. They could mine and dig with remarkable efficiency, creating vast underground networks of tunnels and chambers. Some Orcs even rose to positions of leadership, becoming chieftains and captains, though they ruled their underlings with the same cruelty they themselves endured from above. In those first ages, after Melkor was imprisoned, the Orcs scattered across Middle-earth. They sought out the darkest places, the deepest caverns, the most desolate wildernesses. They established strongholds in the mountains, particularly in the far north, where Melkor's influence had been strongest. They raided and pillaged when they could, attacking any settlements of elves or later men that they encountered. But they were not yet the organized military force they would become. They were more like vermin, lurking in the shadows, hated and feared, but not yet capable of open warfare against the great powers of the world. The elves, for their part, hunted Orcs wherever they found them. There was no mercy in this, no possibility of redemption or peace. The elves saw the Orcs as abominations, as twisted mockeries that needed to be destroyed. And the Orcs in turn hated the elves with a special venom, for in the elves they saw a reflection of what they had once been, what had been stolen from them. This mutual hatred would endure through all the ages of the world. Melkor remained imprisoned in Valinor for 3 ages of the world, a time span so vast it is difficult for mortal minds to comprehend. During this time, he feigned repentance, playing the part of a humbled and reformed Valar. He was eventually released, a decision the Valar would come to bitterly regret. For as soon as he was free and able, Melkor returned to his evil ways. He stirred up trouble in Valinor itself, spreading lies and discord among the elves who dwelt there. He committed terrible crimes, including the murder of the elven king Finwë and the theft of the Silmarils, the 3 great jewels that contained the light of the 2 trees themselves. After these crimes, Melkor fled Valinor and returned to Middle-earth, to the far north where his ancient fortress of Angband still stood. Angband had been delved even deeper than Utumno, and though the Valar had broken it open once, it had been rebuilt in secret by Melkor's lieutenant, a Maya spirit named Sauron. Melkor took the name Morgoth, the Black Enemy, and claimed it as his own, and from Angband he prepared for war. The orcs who had survived in hiding during their master's long absence now flocked to Morgoth's banner. They poured out of their holes and caves, rallying to Angband in numbers beyond counting. Morgoth had not forgotten his children of darkness. He welcomed them, armed them, organized them into vast armies, and he continued his breeding programs, working to create new strains of orcs, some larger and more powerful, others smaller and more cunning. It was in this time that Morgoth also began experimenting with other races. When men, the second-born children, awakened in the far east of Middle-earth, some of them fell under Morgoth's influence early on. These he also corrupted, though not to the same degree as the elves had been. Some scholars believe that Morgoth crossbred men with his orcs, creating half-breeds that combined the worst qualities of both races. These Uruks, as they were sometimes called, were larger and stronger than common orcs, and could tolerate sunlight better, though they still preferred the dark. Morgoth also created other servants, other monsters. Trolls, which were like orcs but far larger and stronger, though also far more stupid. Dragons, worms of fire and darkness that would become the terror of the ages. Werewolves and vampires and other creatures of nightmare. But the orcs remained his primary force, his expendable soldiers, the dark tide that he would throw against his enemies again and again. The elves who had dwelt in Valinor, the Noldor, pursued Morgoth to Middle-earth, seeking revenge for the murder of their king and the theft of the Silmarils. They came in ships and in great hosts, and they established kingdoms in the northern lands of Middle-earth in a region called Beleriand. And so began the Wars of Beleriand, conflicts that would last for centuries and involve countless battles between the armies of the elves and the forces of Morgoth. The orcs were there in every battle, in every siege, in every raid and ambush. They died in their thousands, in their tens of thousands, thrown against the elven lines like waves breaking against a cliff. Morgoth cared nothing for their lives. They were tools to him, weapons to be used and discarded. But they kept coming, for their numbers were vast, and Morgoth's foundries never stopped producing more. Life for an orc in Morgoth's service was brutal and short. They lived in the dark halls of Angband or in military camps in the wastelands around it. They were organized into companies and regiments, each led by larger, meaner orcs who kept order through violence and fear. They trained for war because war was all they knew. When they were not fighting, they were drilling, or forging weapons, or digging fortifications. There was no joy in their existence, no pleasure, except the cruel sort that came from dominating those weaker than themselves. They were fed slop and offal, given just enough to keep them functional. They wore crude armor of black iron, heavy and uncomfortable. They carried weapons that were designed to kill efficiently but were ugly and graceless. Scimitars and broad blades, serrated edges meant to cause terrible wounds. Bows that were powerful but crude. Spears and axes and wicked curved knives. Among themselves, orcs formed rough hierarchies based on strength and cruelty. The strongest led, the weak served or died. There was no loyalty among them except the loyalty of fear. They would betray each other without hesitation if it meant currying favor with their superiors or avoiding punishment. They fought among themselves constantly when not held in check by their masters, settling disputes with violence, sometimes even eating their own dead. Yet for all their wretchedness, the Orcs served their purpose. They were the countless hordes that allowed Morgoth to wage war on multiple fronts. They were the garrison troops that held his fortresses. They were the raiders that kept his enemies off balance. They were the workers that dug his mines and forged his weapons. Without them, Morgoth's war machine would have ground to a halt. And so they suffered and died in service to a master who viewed them as nothing more than disposable resources. They knew no other life, could imagine no other existence. They were born in darkness, lived in darkness, and died in darkness, and their brief, terrible lives were spent causing pain and suffering to others, because pain and suffering was all they had ever known. This was the terrible birth and early existence of the Orcs. Born from the corruption of beauty, raised in cruelty, used as tools of destruction. They were victims who became victimizers, tragic in their way, yet responsible for countless evils. They were Morgoth's greatest and most enduring crime against the world, a living wound that would never fully heal. But the story of the Orcs is far from over, dear friends. In the chapters to come, we shall see how they fought in the great wars, how they endured after Morgoth's fall, and how they would trouble Middle-earth for all the ages until the very end of the Third Age. But for now, rest easy in the knowledge that even the darkest creations have a history worth understanding. Sleep well, and we shall continue our journey soon. Welcome back, dear listeners. Tonight, we continue our exploration of the Orcs of Middle-earth, and we turn our attention to something that might seem strange to consider. We shall look at how Orcs lived, if such a word can truly be used for their existence. We shall examine their society, their language, their daily routines, and the ways in which they organized themselves when not actively engaged in warfare. For even the most wretched of creatures must have some structure to their lives, some pattern to their days, however grim those patterns might be. Let us begin with the most fundamental question. How did Orcs organize themselves? What sort of society, if it can be called that, did they create? The answer is both simple and brutal. Orc society was based entirely on power, specifically physical power and cruelty. The strong dominated the weak, the cruel rose above the kind, and mercy was seen as the ultimate weakness. An Orc who showed compassion to another, who hesitated to inflict pain, who questioned orders, would quickly find themselves at the bottom of the hierarchy, or worse, dead. At the top of any Orc community was always the strongest, meanest Orc available. This might be a chieftain, a war leader, or simply the biggest brute who could beat all challengers into submission. These leaders ruled through fear and violence, maintaining their position by regularly demonstrating their willingness and ability to kill anyone who challenged them. Leadership among Orcs was not inherited, not chosen through any democratic process, but taken and held by force. Beneath the top leader were various sub-chiefs and captains, each commanding their own bands or companies of lesser orcs. These captains were themselves in constant competition, jockeying for position, currying favor with the chieftain while simultaneously looking for any sign of weakness they could exploit. Betrayal was not just common, it was expected. An orc captain who saw an opportunity to move up in the ranks by eliminating a rival would take it without hesitation. The common orcs, the rank and file soldiers and workers, existed at the bottom of this vicious pyramid. They had no rights, no protections, no recourse if they were mistreated. They obeyed orders or they were killed. They worked until they dropped or they were killed. They fought in battle or they were killed. Life for a common orc was a never-ending struggle for survival in a society designed to crush the weak. Interestingly, despite this brutal hierarchy, orcs did form what might charitably be called friendships, or perhaps partnerships would be a better word. Orcs who fought together, who survived battles together, developed a sort of rough camaraderie. They would watch each other's backs, share food, cover for each other when dealing with their superiors. But even these bonds were fragile, built on mutual benefit rather than genuine affection. Turn your back on your orc companion at the wrong moment, show too much weakness, and you might find a knife between your ribs. The orcs also had a peculiar relationship with their masters, the great dark powers they served. Whether it was Morgoth in the First Age, Sauron in later ages, or lesser dark lords like the Nazgul or Saruman, orcs served with a combination of fear and twisted loyalty. They feared their masters absolutely, knowing that disobedience meant suffering beyond death itself. But they also took a sort of pride in serving powerful beings, in being part of something greater than themselves, even if that something was fundamentally evil. Morgoth and later Sauron maintained control over the orcs through several methods. First, there was raw power. These Dark Lords could reach into the minds of their servants, inflicting agony with a thought, snuffing out life with a whim. No orc was strong enough to resist such power, and they knew it. Second, there was the promise of reward. Orcs who served well might be given better food, better weapons, positions of authority over other orcs. These rewards were meager, but in the grinding poverty of orc existence, even a slightly larger portion of meat was worth fighting for. But perhaps the most insidious method of control was the simple fact that the orcs had nowhere else to go. They were hated by every other race in Middle-earth. Elves killed them on sight. Men feared and despised them. Dwarves had ancient grudges against them. The orcs had no allies, no friends, no option but to serve the dark powers who at least tolerated their existence and gave them purpose, however dark that purpose might be. Now, let us turn to the matter of language, for it reveals much about the nature of orc society. Orcs spoke many languages, or perhaps it would be better to say many dialects of the same base language. In the early days, each tribe of orcs developed its own tongue, rough and guttural, filled with harsh consonants and words that sounded like curses even when they were not. These languages were ugly by design, reflecting the ugliness of the creatures who spoke them. There was no poetry in orc speech, no beauty, no grace. Words were tools for communication, for issuing orders, for making threats. The diversity of orc languages became a problem as the orc populations grew and spread across Middle-earth. Orcs from different regions literally could not understand each other, which made coordinating large military campaigns difficult. To solve this problem, orcs adopted a debased form of the common speech, the language that men and other races used to communicate between different peoples. But the orcs corrupted even this, filling it with their own crude words, their own harsh pronunciations. Later, much later in the Second Age, the Dark Lord Sauron created a unified language specifically for his servants. This was the Black Speech, and it was designed to be as hateful and terrible as possible. Sauron crafted it deliberately to offend the ear, to make even simple statements sound like threats or curses. The Black Speech had no words for beauty or love or joy, but dozens of words for different types of pain, suffering, and domination. The most famous phrase in the Black Speech is the inscription on the One Ring itself, which translated reads, "One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them." Even in translation, the malice and the will to dominate are clear. In the original Black Speech, it was even worse, each word dripping with evil intent. Most orcs never fully learned the Black Speech. It was primarily used by Sauron's higher servants, the Nazgul, and certain captains. Common orcs picked up a few words and phrases, using them as curses or battle cries, but continued to speak their own crude dialects among themselves. This actually suited Sauron fine, as the Black Speech was as much a tool of control as communication. By making it difficult and unpleasant to speak, he ensured that only the most loyal and determined of his servants would master it. Orc names were equally harsh and ugly. They had no surnames or family names, as orcs had no concept of family in the way other races did. An orc might be called Grishnak, Ugluk, Gorbag, Shagrat, or Azog. These names were often descriptive, referring to some physical characteristic or personality trait, and they were usually unflattering. An orc didn't choose their own name. It was given to them by their superiors or their peers, often as a form of mockery. Now, what of the daily life of orcs? What did they do when not actively fighting wars? The answer is that orcs were kept constantly busy, for idle orcs were dangerous orcs. When not in battle, they were training for battle. When not training, they were working, mining ore, forging weapons, building fortifications, or performing whatever labor their masters required. The Dark Lords understood that orcs left to their own devices would inevitably turn on each other, so they kept them occupied. Orc strongholds, whether the vast underground fortresses like Angband and later Barad-dûr, or smaller outposts in mountains and caves, were places of constant activity. The forges burned day and night, for orcs needed endless supplies of weapons and armor. The mines delved ever deeper, seeking iron and other metals. Training grounds echoed with the clash of weapons as orc warriors practiced their brutal combat techniques. Orcs ate poorly, and what they ate would turn the stomach of most other races. They were not picky eaters, consuming whatever was available. Moldy bread, rancid meat, even things that had been dead for far too long. There were dark rumors, spoken in whispers, that orcs sometimes ate their own dead, especially after battles when food was scarce. Whether this was true or merely propaganda spread by their enemies is unclear. But given the depths of depravity to which orcs could sink, it was certainly possible. They drank when they could get it, favoring strong, harsh drinks that burned going down. Orc brewers made a sort of ale that was more like poison than beverage, thick and dark and foul tasting, but it had the virtue of being strong enough to dull the pain of their existence for a little while. Drunken orcs were even more violent and unpredictable than sober ones, and fights would break out in the drinking halls regularly. Orcs slept in communal barracks, great halls filled with rough bunks or simply spaces on the floor where they would collapse when exhaustion finally overcame them. There was no privacy, no comfort, no respite from the constant presence of their fellows. They slept with their weapons close at hand, for an orc never knew when they might need to defend themselves from their own comrades. One of the most significant aspects of orc life was their relationship with darkness and light. As we have discussed, orcs hated light, especially sunlight. This was not merely a preference, but a physical affliction. Sunlight weakened them, made them sluggish and fearful. Their eyes, adapted to seeing in complete darkness, were painfully sensitive to bright light. When forced to travel or fight in daylight, orcs would cover themselves as much as possible, moving in misery and complaining constantly. This hatred of light had practical implications for how orc society functioned. Orc strongholds were built deep underground, in places where no natural light could penetrate. The corridors were lit, when they were lit at all, by torches or by the glow of forges, creating a perpetual twilight. Orcs preferred it this way. In the darkness they felt safe, powerful, at home. The orcs also had a peculiar relationship with nature. They hated it. Growing things, green things, beautiful things, all of these inspired rage in orcs. They would destroy forests when they could, cutting down trees not for the wood, but simply to destroy them. They would pollute streams and rivers, foul clean water with their waste and the runoff from their forges. They represented the opposite of natural growth, being instead agents of destruction and decay. Yet for all their wretchedness, orcs were not entirely without skill. They were excellent miners, able to dig through solid rock with remarkable speed. Their tunnels were crude and ugly but functional. They had a knack for finding ore and gems, though they valued these only as resources for their masters, not for any inherent beauty. Orc smiths, while lacking the artistry of elven or dwarven craftsmen, were capable of producing weapons and armor in vast quantities. Their work was brutal and functional, designed to kill and to protect with no thought for aesthetics. An orc blade was ugly, often serrated or barbed to cause terrible wounds, but it was also effective. Orc armor was heavy and uncomfortable, but it would turn aside a sword stroke well enough. Orcs also had a certain crude cunning when it came to military engineering. They could build siege engines, battering rams, siege towers. They could undermine walls, dig sap tunnels, set traps and ambushes. They learned from their enemies, copying and adapting tactics and technologies, always looking for new ways to kill more efficiently. But in all of this, in all their skills and their survival strategies, there was no joy. Orcs did not take pride in their work the way a dwarf might pride himself on a well-crafted axe. They did not find satisfaction in creation. They worked because they were forced to work. They fought because they were ordered to fight. And they existed because they had no choice but to exist. The truly tragic aspect of Orc society was that it was entirely self-perpetuating. Orcs raised their young, what few survived infancy, to be just as cruel and brutal as they were. Young Orcs learned from their first moments that the world was a place of pain, that trust led to betrayal, that mercy was weakness. They learned to hate before they learned to speak, to fight before they learned to reason. And so each generation of Orcs was just as wretched as the one before, trapped in a cycle of violence and suffering that had no end. There were no Orc artists, no Orc poets, no Orc philosophers. There were no Orc healers who worked from compassion, rather than merely patching up soldiers to send them back into battle. There were no Orc teachers except those who taught the arts of war. Orc culture, such as it was, consisted entirely of violence, domination, and service to dark powers. And yet, and this is important to understand, Orcs were not mindless monsters. They could think, could plan, could reason. They had personalities, however warped. They could feel emotions, though those emotions were mostly hatred, fear, and anger. They were not animals, not beasts acting on instinct. They were thinking, feeling beings who had been corrupted into evil, and that made their existence all the more tragic. For if Orcs could think and feel, then surely they could suffer. And suffer they did endlessly, in a society that was designed to maximize suffering and channel it into violence against others. They were both victims and perpetrators, trapped in roles they did not choose but could not escape. This was the nature of Orc society, dear friends. A dark mirror of civilization taking all the structures and hierarchies that other races used to build and protect, and perverting them into tools of oppression and destruction. It was a society built on fear, sustained by cruelty, and dedicated to the service of evil. But we must not forget that behind all of this, pulling the strings, were the Dark Lords themselves, Morgoth and Sauron. The Orcs were their instruments, and while the Orcs bore responsibility for their actions, the ultimate blame lay with those who had created them and those who commanded them. In our next chapter, we shall see these servants of shadow put to their intended use, as we explore the great wars of the First Age and the terrible role the Orcs played in them. But for now, rest easy. The darkness we have explored tonight is balanced by the knowledge that such evil was opposed, that heroes rose to fight against it, and that even the mightiest of Dark Lords would eventually fall. Sleep well, my friends, and we shall continue our journey soon. Welcome back, dear friends, to another evening by the fireside of memory. Tonight, we turn our gaze to war, to the great and terrible conflicts of the first age of Middle-earth, when the exiled elves of Valinor made their stand against Morgoth the enemy, and the Orcs became the dark tide that crashed against the shores of hope time and time again. These were wars that would shape the destiny of the world, and the Orcs were there in every battle, bleeding and dying in their countless thousands. Let us begin our tale in the years after Morgoth returned to Middle-earth and established himself in the fortress of Angband in the far north. The Noldor elves, pursuing him from Valinor to reclaim the stolen Silmarils, had arrived in Middle-earth and established kingdoms throughout the land of Beleriand. These kingdoms were strong and fair, filled with warriors of great skill and lords of ancient wisdom. Against them, Morgoth would throw army after army of orcs, testing their defenses, seeking weakness, grinding them down through sheer weight of numbers. The first great battle was called the Battle of Sudden Flame, and it lived up to its name in the most terrible way. For many years, the elves had maintained a siege of Angband, surrounding Morgoth's fortress with armies and watchtowers containing his power. But Morgoth had been preparing in secret, building his forces, planning his breakout, and when he struck with devastating fury. It began with fire. Morgoth sent forth rivers of flame from Angband, burning across the plain before his gates. The elf warriors who had maintained the siege were caught unprepared, consumed by the flames, or forced to flee in disarray. Behind the fire came the Orcs, not in small raiding parties, but in vast armies, organized and equipped for total war. They poured out of Angband like a black flood, overwhelming the scattered elven forces, breaking through the siege lines and spreading across Beleriand like a plague. The Orcs in this battle fought with a ferocity born of long confinement and their master's iron will. They feared Morgoth more than they feared death, and they had been promised rich rewards, spoils and slaves, and the chance to inflict suffering on the elves they hated so much. They came in waves, the front ranks driven forward by the ranks behind, pressed on by Orc captains with whips and swords, and behind them all, the dark presence of Morgoth's will. The elves fought desperately, their lines reforming, their princes rallying what forces they could. And here we must understand something about the difference between elven and orc warriors. An elf warrior was worth many orcs in single combat. Elves were taller, stronger, faster, more skilled with their weapons. They wore fine armor and carried blades that had been forged by master smiths. They fought with discipline and courage, and they did not break easily. But the orcs had numbers. For every orc that fell to an elven blade, there were 3 more to take its place. The orcs did not need to be better warriors. They only needed to be numerous enough, relentless enough, willing to die in sufficient numbers to eventually overwhelm even the most skilled defenders. And die they did, in heaps, in piles of corpses that grew higher than a man's head. But still they came. The Battle of Sudden Flame raged for days, and when it finally ended, the siege of Angband was broken. The elven lines had been shattered, and though the elves rallied and established new defensive positions further south, they had suffered terrible losses, and the orcs had proven that they were not merely raiders and bandits, but a military force capable of conquering kingdoms. In the years that followed, the wars continued. There was the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, perhaps the most terrible conflict of the entire First Age. The elves and their allies, including men who had joined their cause, gathered a great host and marched against Angband, hoping to destroy Morgoth once and for all, but Morgoth had prepared for them. He had spies among their councils, traitors who fed him information about their plans. When the allied army arrived before Angband, they found the orc armies waiting for them, drawn up in battle formation across the plain. And the battle that followed was slaughter on a scale that Middle-earth had never seen. The orcs came at the allied forces in endless waves, dying by the thousands, but always replaced by fresh troops from Angband's inexhaustible reserves. The fighting was brutal and personal. Orc warriors with their crude but effective weapons clashing against elven swords and spears. The orcs fought without mercy, taking no prisoners, giving no quarter. When an enemy fell, they did not simply kill them. They mutilated the bodies, driven by a hatred that went beyond reason. The elves, for their part, slew orcs with cold efficiency, knowing that mercy shown to an orc was wasted. For orcs understood only force. The battle turned when Morgoth unleashed his dragons, great worms of fire that had never been seen before in warfare. But even before the dragons came, the orcs had been doing their terrible work, bleeding the allied army, wearing them down. When the rout finally came, when the allied forces broke and fled, the orcs pursued them with savage joy, cutting down the retreating warriors, taking vengeance for every orc that had fallen. The fields were carpeted with the dead, so many that it was said a man could walk 4 miles stepping only on corpses, and most of those corpses were orcs, for they had died in numbers beyond counting. But they had won. They had broken the back of elven resistance in the north, and Morgoth's dominion was secured. But not all of the wars went in Morgoth's favor, and it is important to understand that the orcs, for all their numbers, had significant weaknesses. Their hatred of sunlight meant that they fought poorly during the day, preferring night attacks and ambushes. Their lack of discipline meant that they could be panicked and scattered if their leaders were slain. Their cruelty toward each other meant that they would sometimes fight among themselves even in the middle of a battle if they felt their commanders were being unfair with the distribution of loot. The elves learned to exploit these weaknesses. They would strike at orc camps at dawn when the orcs were sluggish and disoriented by the light. They would use archers to target orc captains, knowing that without leadership, orc formations would dissolve into chaos. They would use the orcs' greed against them, leaving tempting but trapped treasures for raiding parties to find. There were sieges as well, terrible sieges that lasted for years. The fortress city of Gondolin, hidden in the mountains and protected by powerful magic, was besieged by Morgoth's forces. The orcs surrounded it, cutting off supply lines, launching attacks whenever an opportunity presented itself. But the walls of Gondolin were high and strong, and the defenders were skilled and determined. The Orcs tried everything. They built siege towers, only to see them burned by the defenders. They tried to undermine the walls, but the stone of the mountains was too hard. They sent waves of warriors with ladders and ropes, but these were thrown back with heavy losses. For years the siege continued, and for years the Orcs died in their attempts to break through. Eventually, Gondolin did fall, but not through Orc assault. It fell through betrayal and the use of dragons. Yet even in that final battle, the Orcs played their role, pouring into the city once the walls were breached, spreading through the streets, killing and destroying. The fall of Gondolin was one of the great tragedies of the First Age, and the Orcs had their share of the blame, even if they were merely the instruments of Morgoth's will. Throughout all these wars, the Orcs served not only as soldiers, but as laborers and builders. They constructed Morgoth's war machines, great siege engines and towers. They mined iron and other metals to feed the forges that produced endless weapons. They built roads through the wastelands to allow Morgoth's armies to move more quickly. They were the backbone of Morgoth's war effort, the workers and the fighters, the expendable resources that he used without thought or care. The Orcs also served as occupying forces in conquered territories. When Morgoth's armies overran an elven settlement, the Orcs would be left behind to hold it, to ensure that the survivors did not regroup and resist. These occupations were nightmares for those who fell under them. The Orcs would loot and destroy, taking anything of value back to Angband, burning what they could not carry. Any elves or men they captured would be taken as slaves, dragged back to the dungeons to suffer fates worse than death. But we must remember that the Orcs themselves were suffering all this time. Every battle they fought, they were the ones dying in the greatest numbers. Every siege they mounted, they were the ones being shot down by elven archers, crushed by dropped stones, burned by defensive fires. They were sent on missions that were essentially suicide, ordered to attack positions that could not be taken, sacrificed to test enemy defenses, or simply because Morgoth wanted to keep them occupied. The Orc warriors who survived battle after battle became veterans of sorts, harder and more dangerous than the raw recruits. These veterans learned to fight more effectively, developed crude but effective tactics, and earned positions of minor authority. But their survival was more due to luck than skill. For in the chaos of the great battles, an individual Orc's fate was more often determined by where they happened to be standing than by any personal prowess. There were Orc captains who became known to the elves by name, leaders who commanded large forces and won notable victories. These Orcs were among the most dangerous of their kind, combining the natural cunning of their race with experience and a degree of tactical skill. But even they were ultimately expendable in Morgoth's eyes, and many met their ends when they failed to achieve impossible objectives, or when Morgoth simply grew tired of them. The wars of the First Age also saw orcs fighting alongside other dark creatures. Trolls, those massive, stupid but immensely strong cousins of the orcs, would be used as shock troops, smashing through enemy lines while the orcs exploited the breaches. Werewolves and other shapeshifters would sow terror and confusion. And above all, there were the dragons, whom the orcs feared almost as much as their enemies did. For dragons had been known to eat orcs when they grew hungry. One aspect of the wars that is often overlooked is the impact they had on the lands themselves. The beautiful realm of Beleriand, with its forests and rivers and fair cities, was gradually destroyed by centuries of warfare. The orcs contributed heavily to this destruction, burning forests, polluting waters, turning farmland into wasteland. Everywhere the orc armies marched, they left ruin in their wake. The orcs also developed a particular hatred for certain elven lords and heroes, those who had slain many of their kind or who had inflicted notable defeats on orc armies. Names like Fingolfin, who had wounded Morgoth himself, or Hurin, a mortal man who had slain 70 trolls and countless orcs in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. These heroes were marked for special attention, and the orcs would go to great lengths to try to bring them down, though they rarely succeeded. As the First Age drew toward its close, the wars reached a climax. The Valar, watching from their blessed realm in the west, finally decided to intervene. They sent a great host, an army of powers and elves from Valinor, to make war on Morgoth and end his tyranny once and for all. This was the War of Wrath, and it was the greatest battle the world had ever seen. The orcs fought in this final battle, as they had fought in all the others, with desperate courage born of terror. They knew that if Morgoth fell, they would have no protection, no master to serve. They would be hunted down and destroyed. So they fought with the fury of the doomed, throwing themselves against the armies of the Valar with reckless abandon. But it was not enough. It could never have been enough. The power arrayed against them was too great. The armies of the Valar broke the gates of Angband, cast down its towers, and dragged Morgoth forth in chains. And with Morgoth's defeat, his armies collapsed. The dragons were slain, the trolls scattered, and the orcs broke and fled in all directions, seeking any dark hole or deep cave where they might hide from the wrath of the victors. Many orcs died in that final battle, crushed beneath falling towers, burned by dragon fire, cut down by vengeful elves, but many more survived, fleeing into the wildernesses, into the deep places of the world, there to hide and multiply and wait for a new master to give them purpose. The wars of the First Age ended with Morgoth's defeat, but the orcs endured. They were his legacy, his lasting curse upon the world, and though he was gone, cast into the void beyond the circles of the world, his children of darkness remained, and they would trouble Middle-earth for ages to come. But that, dear friends, is a tale for our next chapter. For now, let us rest with the knowledge that even the greatest evil can be defeated, even if its echoes linger. The wars of the First Age were terrible beyond measure, but they ended in victory for the forces of light, however costly that victory might have been. Sleep well, and know that darkness, no matter how deep, cannot endure forever in the face of courage and hope. Welcome back, my dear listeners, Tonight we find ourselves at a turning point in the history of the Orcs, a moment when everything changed and yet, tragically, nothing changed at all. We speak of the years following the War of Wrath, when Morgoth was defeated and cast into the void and the Orcs were left masterless, scattered and yet somehow still surviving. This is a chapter about endurance, about the stubborn persistence of evil, even when its greatest champion has fallen. When the armies of the Valar broke the gates of Angband and dragged Morgoth forth in chains, the Orc host scattered like leaves before a storm. The great fortress that had been their home, their factory, their prison, was cast down, its towers toppled, its dungeons opened to the sky. The Orcs who had lived there all their lives suddenly found themselves homeless, leaderless, with the armies of their enemies hunting them across the wastelands. Many Orcs died in those terrible days of reckoning. The elves, remembering centuries of war and suffering, showed no mercy. They hunted the fleeing Orcs with grim determination, cutting them down wherever they were found. The men who had fought alongside the elves joined in this hunt, and even the dwarves who had their own ancient grudges against the Orc kind took part. It seemed for a time that the Orcs might be exterminated entirely, wiped from the face of the earth as thoroughly as the dragons had been. But the Orcs were survivors. They had been bred to endure, to persist, to cling to life even in the most hostile of circumstances. And Middle-earth was vast, filled with dark places and deep caves where pursuers could not follow or would not think to look. The Orcs fled into these places, into the roots of the mountains, into the depths of ancient forests, into the dark corners of the world where light seldom reached, the land of Beleriand where the great wars of the First Age had been fought, was destroyed in the War of Wrath. The tumult of that final battle was so great that the very shape of the land changed. Much of it sank beneath the waves of the sea, drowned forever. The surviving Orcs could not remain there even if they had wanted to. They had to flee eastward, across the mountains, into the wider lands of Middle-earth that lay beyond. It was in these years of flight and scattering that the Orcs faced their greatest challenge. Without a master to organize them, to direct them, to give them purpose, they reverted to their base nature. They formed small bands, tribes led by the strongest or most cunning among them. These tribes fought with each other as often as they fought with other races, competing for territory, for food, for the dark holes and caves that provided shelter. Many Orc tribes settled in the misty mountains, that great range that ran like a spine down the center of Middle-earth. The mountains were perfect for Orcs. They were riddled with caves and tunnels, many of them natural, others dug in ancient days by dwarves and then abandoned. The mountains were cold and harsh, inhospitable to most races, but the Orcs thrived there. They could travel through the mountains using underground passages, emerging to raid the lands on either side, then disappearing back into their holes before retribution could find them. One mountain in particular became significant to Orkine. This was Mount Gundabad, in the far north of the Misty Mountains. The Orcs came to regard Gundabad as a sacred place. though what orcs considered sacred was twisted and dark. They believed that the first orcs had been created there, though this was not true. Utumno and Angband had been the sites of the orcs' terrible birth. But the orcs had short memories and a tendency to mythologize their own history, and Gundabad became important to them regardless of the truth. At Gundabad, orc tribes would gather in great numbers. It became a sort of capital for the scattered orc race, a place where different tribes could meet, trade, and occasionally unite under particularly powerful chieftains. The orcs fortified Gundabad, digging deeper into the mountain, creating vast halls and armories. It would remain a center of orc power for thousands of years. But Gundabad was not the only orc stronghold. Throughout the Misty Mountains and beyond, orcs established themselves in dozens, perhaps hundreds of locations. Some were small, nothing more than a few caves inhabited by a single tribe. Others were large and complex, with multiple levels and chambers, capable of housing thousands of orcs. These strongholds became the new homes of orc kind, replacing the centralized power of Angband with a distributed network of independent settlements. Life for orcs in these years was, in many ways, harder than it had been under Morgoth. There was no one to organize the production of weapons and armor on a large scale. Each tribe had to fend for itself, to forge its own weapons, to find its own food. The strong tribes dominated the weak, taking the best territories, the richest mines. The weak tribes were pushed into marginal areas, barely surviving, always on the edge of starvation. Yet this very hardship ensured that the orcs remained dangerous. They could not grow soft or complacent. They had to fight constantly against other orcs, against the other races of Middle-earth, even against the harsh environment itself. This created a sort of natural selection where only the most vicious and cunning orcs survived to breed. In some ways, the orcs of this era were even more dangerous than their ancestors, hardened by necessity into efficient predators. The orcs also maintained their old habits of raiding and pillaging. They would descend from the mountains in small bands, attacking isolated farms, small villages, unwary travelers. They took food, tools, weapons, anything they could use or trade. They also took prisoners when they could, dragging them back to their lairs to serve as slaves or, in some dark cases, as food. These raids kept the surrounding lands in a state of constant fear and vigilance. Interestingly, the orcs of this period began to develop distinct regional characteristics. The orcs of the Misty Mountains, living in cold, high altitudes, tended to be smaller and hardier than their cousins elsewhere. The orcs that settled in the forest became more adept at moving quietly and setting ambushes. Those that remained in the far north, near the ruins of Angband, were the most savage and the most twisted, perhaps because they lived closest to the lingering evil of that cursed place. During these long years of the Second Age, as they came to be called, the orcs multiplied. Without the constant wars of the First Age to thin their numbers, and with their rapid breeding cycles, the orc population grew steadily. They filled the dark places of Middle-earth, spreading like a plague through the roots of the mountains. But something was missing from the orcs' existence. They had no grand purpose, no unifying goal. They raided and fought and survived, but there was a hollowness to it all. They had been created to serve, bred to obey, and without a master they were adrift. Individual orcs might not have recognized this lack, but collectively, the race was incomplete, waiting for something, though they did not know what. That something came in the form of Sauron. Sauron had been Morgoth's lieutenant, the greatest of his servants, a Maya spirit who had turned to darkness in the ancient days. When Morgoth was defeated and cast into the void, Sauron had hidden, feigning repentance, biding his time. But his nature was too corrupt for true redemption. Eventually, he revealed himself, claiming dominion over Middle-earth in his master's place. The orcs, leaderless and scattered for so long, began to feel Sauron's pull. He was not as powerful as Morgoth had been, not as terrible or as absolute, but he was still a Dark Lord, still a being of immense power and malice, and more importantly, he wanted the orcs, needed them for his own plans of conquest. Sauron did not immediately reveal himself to the orcs. He worked subtly at first, appearing in fair form, calling himself Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. He deceived the elves, teaching them the art of ring-making, while secretly forging the One Ring to control all others. But while he played this long game with the elves, he was also gathering his true forces, and chief among these were the orcs. Messengers came to the orc strongholds, emissaries of the new Dark Lord, bearing promises of power, of purpose, of a return to the glory days when the orcs had been a mighty army rather than scattered bandits. And the orcs, remembering the structure and purpose that Morgoth had provided, even though it had been cruel and terrible, began to rally to Sauron's banner. Sauron established himself in the land of Mordor in the southeast of Middle-earth. There he built his own fortress, the Dark Tower of Barad-dûr, which would rival even Angband in its terrible majesty. And to Mordor came the orcs, not all of them, but many, drawn by the promise of serving a master once again. They came from the misty mountains, from the gray mountains in the north, from hidden strongholds scattered across Middle-earth. In Mordor, Sauron reorganized the orcs along the lines that Morgoth had established. He formed them into armies, companies, and regiments. He set them to work mining and forging, building his war machine. But Sauron was more cunning than Morgoth in some ways, more subtle. He understood that the orcs, while useful, were limited. So he began experimenting with ways to improve them. This is when Sauron began his breeding programs in earnest. He crossbred different strains of orcs, trying to create larger, stronger varieties. He also, some scholars believe, began mixing orc blood with that of men, creating half-breeds that combined orc viciousness with human size and endurance. These experiments would eventually lead to the creation of the Uruk-hai, though that achievement would come much later. Not all orcs flocked to Sauron's banner. Some tribes in the Misty Mountains and elsewhere remained independent, preferring their freedom, such as it was, to service under a new master. These independent orcs continued their old ways, armies, raiding and fighting, troubling the lands around them. They were less organized than Sauron's orcs, less numerous, but in some ways more dangerous because they were unpredictable. The Second Age saw the rise of great kingdoms of men and elves, realms of power and beauty. And against these kingdoms Sauron waged war, and his orcs were his primary weapon. The wars of the Second Age were not as cataclysmic as those of the First, but they were nonetheless terrible. And the orcs were there in every battle, dying in their thousands, but always replaced by fresh numbers from Mordor's breeding pits. The most significant event of the Second Age, from the orcs' perspective, was the War of the Last Alliance. This was a great coalition of elves and men, who united to defeat Sauron once and for all. They marched on Mordor with a vast army, and on the plains before the Black Gate they met Sauron's host in battle. The orcs fought desperately in that battle. They knew that if Sauron fell, they would be hunted down again, as they had been after Morgoth's defeat. They threw themselves against the allied lines with suicidal fury, and the battle raged for days. The fields of Dagorlad, as that place was called, were covered with the bodies of the fallen, and most of those bodies were orcs. But once again, the orcs were defeated. Sauron himself was struck down, and though he was not destroyed, his bodily form was slain, and the One Ring was cut from his hand. His armies broke and fled, and the orcs scattered once more into the wilderness, masterless again, hunted again, surviving again through their stubborn refusal to die. And so the Second Age ended as the First had ended, with the orcs defeated but not destroyed, scattered but not exterminated. They retreated to their strongholds in the mountains, to their dark holes and deep caves, and there they endured, waiting once more, breeding and multiplying, keeping their weapons sharp and their hatred keen. The pattern was set. No matter how many times they were defeated, no matter how many of them died, the orcs survived. They were a permanent scar on the face of Middle-earth, a reminder of Morgoth's ancient evil, a threat that could never be entirely eliminated. And though they spent long years without a master, leaderless and scattered, they always endured, waiting for the next dark lord to rise and give them purpose once more. Rest well tonight, dear friends, knowing that even in defeat, even in the darkest of times, life finds a way to persist. The orcs endured not because they were strong, but because they were numerous, adaptable, and too stubborn to die. It is a grim sort of triumph, but a triumph nonetheless. Tomorrow we shall speak of the Third Age, when Sauron returned once more, and the orcs rose again to trouble the world. But for now, sleep peacefully, and may your rest be undisturbed by thoughts of dark mountains and the creatures that lurk within them. Good evening once more, my dear companions in this journey through shadow and time. Tonight we delve deeper into the Second Age, that long period of history when new kingdoms rose and fell, when the world changed and grew, and when the orcs found themselves serving a new master, one who was different from Morgoth in many ways, yet similar in all the ways that mattered. We speak of Sauron the Deceiver, and how he gathered the scattered orc tribes into a new army of darkness. When we last left our tale, The orcs were masterless, scattered throughout Middle-earth, surviving in their mountain strongholds and dark caves. They had endured the fall of Morgoth and the destruction of Angband, but they were diminished, disorganized, lacking the central authority that had once given them purpose and direction. But that was about to change. Sauron, as we have mentioned, had been Morgoth's greatest servant, his lieutenant and most trusted commander. In the First Age, it had been Sauron who managed Angband when Morgoth was occupied elsewhere. Sauron who organized the orc armies. Sauron who planned many of the strategies that had brought the elves to their knees. He was a being of immense power and cunning, a Maya, one of the lesser divine spirits who had chosen to follow Morgoth into darkness. When Morgoth fell, Sauron had hidden himself, fearful of the wrath of the Valar. He had even appeared before them in Valinor, seemingly repentant, asking for mercy. But Sauron's pride would not let him submit to the judgment and humiliation he knew would follow true repentance. So he fled, returning to Middle-earth, and there he hid for many long years, plotting his return to power. The early Second Age was a time of relative peace for Middle-earth. The elves who remained built new kingdoms, fair and prosperous. The race of men was growing in numbers and in strength, establishing their own realms. The dwarves delved deep into their mountain halls, creating wonders of craft and engineering. But in the shadows, Sauron was working slowly, patiently, building his power base. Sauron's first great deception was his appearance to the elves as Anatar, which means Lord of Gifts in their language. He came to them in a fair form, seeming wise and benevolent, and he taught them many things, including the craft of ring-making. The elves, eager for knowledge and power, accepted his teachings, not realizing the trap they were walking into. But while Sauron played this long game with the elves, he was also engaged in a more straightforward project, the gathering and organization of the orcs. Sauron's approach to the orcs was different from Morgoth's. Where Morgoth had ruled through pure terror and overwhelming power, Sauron employed a mixture of fear and manipulation. He understood the orc nature better than Morgoth had, perhaps because he had spent so much time actually managing them. He knew their weaknesses and their strengths, and he knew how to exploit both. His first step was to send messengers to the scattered orc tribes. These messengers spoke of a new lord, a master who would restore the orcs to their former glory, who would organize them, arm them, and lead them to victory against their enemies. They promised food and weapons, protection and purpose, and for orcs who had spent decades or even centuries living like bandits, scraping by in the wilderness, these promises were powerfully tempting. The orc tribes began to send representatives to Mordor, the land that Sauron had chosen for his stronghold. Mordor was perfect for Sauron's purposes, a land surrounded by mountains, defensible, far from the centers of elven power. And it was dark, filled with volcanic activity, with ash and smoke that hung perpetually in the air. The orcs felt at home there almost immediately. In Mordor, Sauron established his fortress of Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower. This was to be his seat of power, a stronghold to rival Angband itself, and the Orcs were put to work building it. Thousands of Orcs labored on the tower, cutting black stone from the mountains, hauling it to the construction site, fitting the massive blocks together under the direction of Sauron's architects. The work was brutal, and many Orcs died in accidents or from exhaustion, but the tower grew, rising higher and higher until it dominated the landscape for miles around. While the tower was being built, Sauron was also reorganizing the Orc tribes into a proper military force. He disbanded the old tribal structures, breaking up groups that had been together for generations and mixing them with Orcs from other regions. This was a deliberate strategy to prevent the formation of power bases that might challenge his authority. An Orc captain who commanded troops from many different tribes was less likely to rebel than one who commanded his own kinsmen. Sauron also established a strict hierarchy, more rigid even than what had existed under Morgoth. There were the common Orcs, the foot soldiers and laborers. Above them were the Orc warriors, better armed and trained, used as shock troops in battle. Above the warriors were the Orc captains, commanders of companies ranging from dozens to hundreds of Orcs. And above the captains were Sauron's own chosen servants, the Nazgul, the Ringwraiths, who commanded the Orc armies in Sauron's name. The Orcs feared the Nazgul even more than they had feared Sauron himself. These wraiths were beings of pure terror, invisible to mortal eyes unless they chose to be seen, emanating an aura of dread that could break the will of even the bravest warrior. When a Nazgul gave an order, Orcs obeyed instantly, without question, without hesitation. To disobey was to invite a fate worse than death. But Sauron did not rule only through fear. He also understood the importance of rewards. Orc captains who served well were given better weapons, better armor, larger commands. They were allowed first pick of any loot taken in raids. They were given authority over other Orcs, the power to command and to punish. For Orcs who had spent their lives being dominated by others, the chance to dominate in turn was a powerful motivator. Sauron also began his breeding programs during this time. He was not content with the Orcs as they existed. He wanted to create better Orcs, stronger, more obedient, more effective in battle. He established breeding pits in Mordor, where Orcs were bred like livestock, with the strongest and most vicious being selected to produce the next generation. This selective breeding produced several new strains of Orcs over the centuries. Some were larger and more powerful than the common Orcs, though still shorter and weaker than the Uruk-hai that would come later. Others were smaller, but faster, bred for scouting and raiding. Sauron experimented constantly, always seeking to improve his Orc stock. There were also dark rumors, never confirmed but widely believed, that Sauron was mixing Orc blood with that of men. The offspring of such unions would theoretically combine the savage nature and rapid breeding of Orcs with the size and endurance of men. Whether these experiments were successful is unclear, but there were reports throughout the Second Age of Orcs that seemed larger and more man-like than usual. Creatures that could move about in daylight, with less discomfort than normal orcs. As Sauron's power grew, so did his ambitions. He forged the One Ring, the master ring that could control all the other rings he had helped the elves create. With the One Ring on his finger, Sauron's power was immense, and he began to make war on the free peoples of Middle-earth openly. The orcs were, as always, the backbone of his military forces. They marched under his banners in vast armies, attacking elven kingdoms, raiding the lands of men, even striking at dwarven strongholds in the mountains. These wars saw the orcs fighting not as disorganized raiders, but as disciplined soldiers, employing tactics and strategies that made them far more dangerous than they had been in the years of their scattering. One of the most significant developments of this period was Sauron's creation of the Black Speech, the language we mentioned in an earlier chapter. Sauron designed this language specifically for his servants, and he mandated that all orcs under his command learn at least the basics. The Black Speech was meant to be a unifying force, giving the orcs a common tongue that would allow them to communicate across tribal lines. But as we noted before, most orcs never fully mastered the Black Speech. It was deliberately difficult and unpleasant to speak, and the orcs, for all their viciousness, were not particularly intellectual. They learned enough to follow orders, to give reports, but among themselves they continued to speak their own crude dialects, mixing in words from the Black Speech as curses and exclamations. The wars of the Second Age reached their climax when the great kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor, founded by men who had come from the island of Numenor, allied with the elves to make a final stand against Sauron. This alliance, called the Last Alliance of Elves and Men, gathered a vast army and marched on Mordor itself. The siege of Barad-dûr lasted for 7 years. 7 years of the allied armies surrounding Sauron's fortress, cutting off supplies, launching attacks, while Sauron's forces, primarily orcs, defended the walls and launched counterattacks. The orcs fought desperately, for they knew that if Sauron fell, they would be hunted down without mercy. During the siege, the orcs suffered terribly. Food ran short, and they were reduced to eating things that would make even their strong stomachs rebel. They were sent on suicidal sorties against the Allied lines, told to break the siege or die trying. Thousands died, their bodies piled so high around Barad-dûr's walls that they had to be burned to prevent disease. But finally the siege ended. Sauron himself came forth to battle, and he was defeated. The hero Isildur cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand, and Sauron's spirit fled his body, unable to take physical form again for many ages. With their master's defeat, the orcs broke. The armies of the Last Alliance pursued them across Mordor, cutting them down by the thousands. Those orcs who escaped the slaughter fled in all directions, but most headed for the Misty Mountains, back to the old strongholds that had sheltered their ancestors after Morgoth's fall. The cycle was repeating itself. Once again, the orcs were masterless, scattered, defeated. Once again, they had to survive on their own, reverting to their old ways of raiding and banditry. But they did survive. Despite everything, Despite losses that would have exterminated any normal race, the Orcs endured. They retreated into their mountain fortresses, into their deep caves, and there they licked their wounds and began once more to rebuild their numbers. The Second Age had seen the Orcs rise to great power under Sauron, had seen them organized into vast armies, had seen them come closer to victory than they had since the days of Morgoth. But it had also seen them defeated again, scattered again, broken again. Yet still they endured, stubborn and unkillable, a permanent curse upon the world. Sauron himself was not destroyed, merely reduced to a spirit without form. He fled to the far corners of Middle-earth, hiding, recovering his strength. And though it would take him many long years to return to power, return he would. And when he did, the Orcs would be waiting, ready to serve their Dark Lord once more. But the Second Age was over, and the Third Age was beginning. An age that would see new struggles, new heroes, and new chapters in the long, dark history of the Orcs. An age that would culminate in the War of the Ring and the final fate of both Sauron and his twisted servants. For now, though, rest easy, dear friends. The tale grows long, and we have much yet to tell. But we have time, and I shall be here to guide you through it all. Sleep well, and may your dreams be peaceful, undisturbed by thoughts of Dark Lords and their shadowy armies. Until tomorrow, when we continue our journey into the Third Age. Welcome back, dear friends, to another chapter in our long journey through the history of the Orcs. Tonight we enter the Third Age of Middle-earth, a time of slow changes and hidden dangers, when the Orcs rebuilt their strength in the shadows while the free peoples enjoyed centuries of relative peace. But peace, as we shall see, is often only the calm before the storm, and the Orcs were preparing for a storm indeed. The Third Age began quietly, at least from the perspective of those who lived in the great kingdoms of men and elves. Sauron was gone, reduced to a bodiless spirit hiding in the dark corners of the world. His fortress of Barad-dûr lay in ruins. Mordor was empty, watched over by the men of Gondor to ensure that no evil could take root there again. The great threat seemed to have passed, and the free peoples allowed themselves to hope that perhaps, this time, darkness had been defeated for good. But the Orcs knew better. In their mountain strongholds, in the deep places beneath the earth, they whispered among themselves that their master would return. They did not know when, they did not know how, but they believed it with a faith that was almost religious. And in the meantime, they did what Orcs always did. They survived, they multiplied, and they prepared. The early centuries of the Third Age saw the Orcs reverting to their old patterns. Without a central authority to organize them, they formed into tribes and war bands, each led by the strongest chieftain they could produce. These tribes competed with each other for the best territories, the richest mines, the most defensible caves. Orc fought Orc almost as often as Orc fought other races, and the strong grew stronger while the weak perished. The Misty Mountains became the primary stronghold of Orc kind once more. That great range of peaks and valleys running north to south through the heart of Middle-earth was perfect for Orcs. It was honeycombed with caves and tunnels, some natural, others carved by dwarves in ages past and then abandoned. The mountains were cold and harsh, discouraging settlement by other races, and they provided perfect bases from which the orcs could raid the lands on either side. One location in particular became important during this time: the ancient dwarven city of Khazad-dûm, which men called Moria. This was the greatest of all dwarven realms, delved deep into the misty mountains, filled with wonders of craft and engineering. The dwarves had lived there for thousands of years, mining mithril, that precious silver metal that was stronger than steel and more beautiful than any gem. But in the year 1980 of the Third Age, disaster struck Khazad-dûm. The dwarves, in their endless delving for mithril, dug too deep. They awakened something that had slumbered in the roots of the mountains since the First Age, a Balrog, a demon of fire and shadow, a creature of the same order as Sauron himself. The Balrog emerged from the depths and drove the dwarves from their ancient home, killing their king and scattering the survivors. The orcs, watching from their own strongholds nearby, saw their opportunity. Once the dwarves were gone, orc tribes began to infiltrate Moria, moving into the abandoned halls, claiming the vast underground city as their own. The Balrog, lurking in the deepest levels, seemed content to let the orcs settle in the upper halls. Perhaps it even welcomed their presence, for orcs could serve as guards and servants, keeping intruders away from its domain. Over the following centuries, Moria became one of the greatest orc strongholds in all of Middle-earth. Thousands of orcs made their homes there, occupying the ancient dwarven halls, defacing the beautiful carvings, turning works of art into crude fortifications. They established forges where once the dwarves had crafted wonders, though the orc work was poor and ugly by comparison. They dug their own tunnels connecting different parts of the vast complex, creating a warren that only they could navigate. From Moria, the orcs launched raids on the surrounding lands. They attacked travelers, attempting to cross the mountains through the pass of Caradhras or through the tunnel system itself. They raided into the lands of Lorien to the east, where the elves dwelt, though they rarely penetrated far into that enchanted realm, for the Lady Galadriel's power kept them at bay. They troubled the lands to the west as well, attacking settlements and wayfarers. But Moria was not the only orc stronghold in the Misty Mountains. Mount Gundabad in the far north remained an important center of orc power, and there were dozens of smaller strongholds scattered throughout the range. Each was ruled by its own chieftain. Each jealously guarded its independence, yet there was a rough network of alliances and trade between them. Orcs from different strongholds would occasionally unite for large raids or to fight common enemies. Speaking of common enemies, the orcs of the Third Age had a particular hatred for the dwarves. This enmity had deep roots, going back to the First Age when dwarves and orcs had first clashed in battle. But it intensified during the Third Age due to several specific conflicts. The most significant of these conflicts began with an orc chieftain named Azog. Azog ruled from Moria and was among the largest and most vicious of his kind. In the year 2790 of the Third Age, a dwarven lord named Thror, who had once been king under the mountain at Erebor, came to Moria. Perhaps he hoped to reclaim the ancient dwarven realm, or perhaps he was simply drawn by nostalgia for the halls of his ancestors. Whatever his reason, it was a fatal mistake. Azog captured Thror and murdered him, but not quickly or cleanly. The Orc chieftain tortured the old king, then beheaded him and branded his name on Thror's forehead in mockery. He sent the body out with a small bag of coins, a final insult suggesting that the dwarf king's life was worth only a few pennies. This act ignited a fury among the dwarves, unlike anything seen since the First Age. Thror's son Thrain called for vengeance, and dwarves from all 7 of the great dwarf houses answered. They gathered an army and marched on Moria, determined to destroy Azog and reclaim their ancient home. The war that followed was brutal and lasted for 6 years. The dwarves attacked orc strongholds throughout the Misty Mountains, destroying them one by one, slaughtering every orc they found. The orcs, for their part, fought with desperate savagery, knowing that the dwarves would show no mercy. Battles raged in dark tunnels and on mountain slopes, and the snow was stained black with orc blood and red with dwarf blood. Finally, in the year 2799, the climactic battle was fought at the east gate of Moria, in the valley of Azanul-Bizar. The dwarves had driven the orcs back, stronghold by stronghold, until only Moria remained. Now they had come to finish it. The battle was catastrophic for both sides. The orcs poured out of Moria in vast numbers, far more than the dwarves had expected. Azog led them personally, a massive orc wielding a great mace, killing dwarves with terrible efficiency. The fighting was hand to hand, brutal beyond description, and for a time it seemed the orcs might actually win through sheer weight of numbers. But the dwarves had something the orcs did not: true courage and the ability to rally, even in the face of overwhelming odds. A young dwarf named Dain, who would later become king under the mountain, killed Azog in single combat, cutting off the orc chieftain's head. With their leader dead, the orcs broke and fled back into Moria, and the dwarves pursued them, killing thousands more in the dark halls. The dwarves had won, but at terrible cost. Nearly half their army was dead or wounded, and despite their victory they could not reclaim Moria, for the Balrog still lurked in its depths, and even the dwarves dared not face such a creature. So they withdrew, and the orcs, though greatly reduced in numbers, remained in possession of the ancient dwarven city. This battle, the Battle of Azanul-Bizar, had profound effects on both races. The dwarves had avenged their king, but they had learned that some prices were too high to pay. The orcs, meanwhile, had learned to fear the dwarves in a new way. They had always known dwarves were tough fighters, but the sheer determination and fury the dwarves had displayed in this war left a lasting impression. Yet the orcs endured, as they always did. They replaced their losses, bred new warriors, and continued their existence in the mountains. And they waited for word was spreading among the Orc tribes that their ancient master was stirring once more. Sauron had indeed returned, though in a form greatly diminished from his former glory. He had taken shape in the southern part of Mirkwood, the great forest in the east of Middle-earth, in a fortress called Dol Guldur. There he hid his true identity, calling himself the Necromancer, slowly gathering his strength and his servants. The Orcs began to feel his pull once more. It started subtly, a whisper in the backs of their minds, a compulsion to move southward, toward Mordor and the neighboring lands. Some Orc tribes resisted, preferring their independence, but many answered the call. They migrated south through the misty mountains, some settling in the southern peaks, others continuing all the way to Mordor itself. In Mordor, the Orcs found that Minas Morgul, once a beautiful elven city but long since captured and corrupted, was being prepared as a stronghold. The Nazgul were gathering there, and they commanded the Orcs to rebuild and fortify the city. The Orcs obeyed, and Minas Morgul became a place of dread, from which Orc raids would trouble the neighboring lands of Gondor. But even as Sauron's power grew, he remained hidden, working through servants and agents not yet ready to reveal himself. The free peoples knew that something dark was stirring, but they did not yet understand the full scope of the threat. They saw increased Orc activity, more raids, more attacks, but they attributed this to the natural ebb and flow of Orc aggression, rather than to any coordinated plan. Meanwhile, in the north, other things were happening. A small creature called Gollum, who had once possessed the One Ring, was captured by Orcs in the Misty Mountains and taken to Sauron in Dol Guldur. From Gollum, Sauron learned crucial information about the ring and about a land called the Shire, where creatures called hobbits dwelt. This information would prove vital to the events that would unfold in the coming years. The Orcs of the Third Age were, in many ways, similar to their ancestors of earlier ages, but there were some differences. They had lived for so long without a single unifying master that they had become more fractious, more independent-minded. When Sauron began to reassert his control, he found that some tribes were more resistant than others, more reluctant to give up the autonomy they had enjoyed. To deal with this, Sauron employed a combination of threats and rewards, much as he had in the Second Age. Tribes that submitted willingly were given weapons and positions of favor. Those that resisted were crushed, their leaders killed, and their warriors scattered among more loyal tribes. Slowly, inexorably, Sauron brought the Orc tribes back under his control. By the middle of the Third Age, the stage was set for the conflicts that would define its end. Sauron was gathering his strength in the east. The Orcs were multiplying and organizing under his command. The free peoples were beginning to realize that the peace they had enjoyed was coming to an end, and somewhere, unbeknownst to anyone, the One Ring still existed, waiting to be found. The Orcs did not know about the ring, at least not most of them. They knew only that their master was calling, that he demanded their service, and that great events were coming. They prepared for war as they always had, forging weapons, training warriors, digging fortifications. They had been defeated before, many times, but they had always survived. And they believed with the stubborn faith that characterized their race that this time would be different. This time they would win. But we shall see in our remaining chapters how those beliefs would be tested, how the Orcs would fight their greatest battles yet, and what fate ultimately awaited them. For now, though, let us rest with the knowledge that, even in the darkest times, when evil gathers its strength and war seems inevitable, there are still those who stand ready to fight against it. Sleep well, dear friends, and we shall continue our tale tomorrow, when we speak of Saruman's betrayal and the creation of a new breed of orc, one more terrible than any that had come before. Until then, may your rest be peaceful. Welcome back, my dear listeners. Tonight, we turn our attention to one of the most significant developments in the long history of the Orcs, a development that came not from Sauron, the Dark Lord, but from one who was supposed to oppose him. We speak of Saruman the White, greatest of the wizards, and how his pride and his lust for power led him to create a new breed of orc, one that would prove to be among the most dangerous ever seen. This is a tale of betrayal, of corruption, and of the terrible consequences that follow when good turns to evil. Saruman the White was not always evil. Indeed, for most of his long existence in Middle-earth, he was a force for good, a wise counselor, and a powerful opponent of the Dark Lord. He was the head of the White Council, an organization of the wise formed to oppose Sauron. He studied the enemy's methods, his strategies, his history, all with the supposed goal of better understanding how to defeat him. But in that study, something went wrong. Perhaps it was pride, the belief that he alone truly understood the nature of power. Perhaps it was envy, jealousy of Gandalf, who was loved where Saruman was merely respected. Perhaps it was simply the slow corruption that comes from staring too long into darkness. Whatever the cause, Saruman began to change. He began to desire power for himself, to see himself not as a servant of the good, but as a potential ruler, a new power in Middle-earth who could impose order through strength. Saruman made his home in Isengard, a fortress in the valley between the southern end of the Misty Mountains and the White Mountains. It had once belonged to Gondor, but that kingdom had weakened over the centuries and could no longer maintain such distant outposts. Saruman had been given stewardship of Isengard, and he had fortified it, making it into a stronghold of considerable power. As Saruman's corruption deepened, he began to look at the problem of the orcs from a different angle. Otherwise beings saw orcs as a plague to be eliminated, but Saruman saw them as a resource, a tool that could be refined and improved. He had studied Sauron's breeding programs, knew about the Dark Lord's attempts to create stronger, better orcs, and Saruman thought, with his superior intellect and his knowledge of ancient lore, that he could do better. Saruman began by gathering orcs to Isengard. He sent agents into the Misty Mountains with promises of food, weapons, and shelter. Some orc tribes Those that were independent and had not yet submitted to Sauron were willing to serve this new master, especially one who seemed less terrifying than the Dark Lord. Slowly, over years and decades, Saruman built up a population of orcs in the caverns beneath Isengard. But Saruman was not content with common orcs. He wanted something better, stronger, more effective. He wanted orcs that could fight in daylight without weakness, that were larger and more powerful than normal orcs, that were disciplined and could follow complex orders. In short, he wanted to create the perfect soldiers. To achieve this, Saruman delved into forbidden lore, ancient texts that spoke of the creation of life, of the blending of different races, of dark sorceries that had been practiced in the elder days and then abandoned as too terrible to continue. He established breeding pits deep beneath Isengard, places where his experiments could be carried out away from prying eyes. The process by which Saruman created his new orcs, the Uruk-hai as they came to be called, was never fully revealed, and perhaps that is for the best. What we know is that he crossbred orcs with men, or perhaps used some form of sorcery to blend their essences. The men he used were likely from the wild tribes that dwelt in the hills around Isengard, men who had been corrupted by promises of power, or who had been captured and forced to serve. The result was something new and terrible. The Uruk-hai stood as tall as men, some even taller, with broad shoulders and long, powerful arms. They were far stronger than common orcs, capable of wielding heavy weapons and wearing thick armor without being slowed. Their skin was black, not the gray or green of normal orcs, but a deep, lightless black like coal. Their eyes burned with a fierce intelligence and cruelty. Most significantly, the Uruk-hai could tolerate sunlight. They did not love it. They still preferred darkness, but it did not weaken them as it did normal orcs. They could march and fight during the day without difficulty, which made them infinitely more dangerous as military forces. An army that could only fight at night was limited, but an army that could fight around the clock was a threat of an entirely different magnitude. Saruman marked his Uruk-hai with his own symbol, a white hand, which they wore as a badge on their armor and shields. This distinguished them from Sauron's orcs and marked them as Saruman's personal troops. The wizard was proud of his creation, seeing in the Uruk-hai proof of his own genius and power. The Uruk-hai themselves were different from normal orcs in temperament as well as body. They were more disciplined, capable of following orders without the constant supervision and threats that normal orcs required. They did not fight among themselves as much, understanding that unity made them stronger. They took a sort of pride in their strength and their status as elite troops, looking down on common orcs as inferior. But make no mistake, the Uruk-hai were still orcs at heart. They were cruel and vicious, delighting in violence and destruction. They had no mercy, no compassion, no loyalty except that which was beaten into them. They served Saruman because he was their creator and their master, and because they feared his power. But given the chance, they would betray him without hesitation. if they thought they could gain by it. Saruman used his Uruk-hai in various ways. He sent them on raids to gather supplies and capture prisoners for his breeding programs. He used them to intimidate his neighbors, demonstrating his power and discouraging any thoughts of opposing him. And he began to move against the realm of Rohan, the kingdom of horsemen that lay to the south of Isengard. Rohan had long been an ally of Gondor and an enemy of Saruman's ambitions. The Rohirrim, as the people of Rohan were called, were fierce warriors and proud, and they stood in the way of Saruman's plans to expand his power. Saruman began a campaign of subtle warfare against Rohan, sending his orcs to raid villages, to steal horses, to kill travelers. He worked to weaken the kingdom from within, using agents and spies to sow discord. But Saruman's greatest test of his Uruk-hai came with the War of the Ring, when events that had been building for thousands of years finally came to a head. The One Ring had been found, had come into the possession of a hobbit named Frodo Baggins, and the fate of Middle-earth hung in the balance. Saruman, believing he could seize the ring for himself, sent a large force of Uruk-hai on a critical mission. They were to capture hobbits who were traveling with a group called the Fellowship of the Ring. Among these hobbits, Saruman believed, might be the ring-bearer himself, or at least those who knew where the ring was. The Uruk-hai tracked the Fellowship along the great river Anduin, moving with speed and determination that common orcs could never have matched. When they finally caught up with their quarry, they attacked with devastating efficiency. The Fellowship was scattered, and the Uruk-hai succeeded in capturing 2 of the hobbits, Merry and Pippin, though not the ring-bearer himself. What followed was a forced march that became legendary. The Uruk-hai, carrying their prisoners, ran day and night across hundreds of miles of wilderness, heading back toward Isengard. They were pursued by 3 members of the Fellowship, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, but the Uruk-hai's endurance was such that they stayed ahead of their pursuers. During this march, we see both the strengths and the weaknesses of the Uruk-hai clearly. They were incredibly strong and tough, able to run for days with minimal rest. They were disciplined, staying in formation, following orders, but they were also arrogant and cruel, and there was tension between them and the common orcs who accompanied them. The Uruk-hai looked down on the smaller orcs, and this created friction that would ultimately prove costly. The march ended at the edge of Fangorn Forest, where the Uruk-hai were attacked by the riders of Rohan. In the battle that followed, most of the Uruk-hai were killed, and the hobbit prisoners escaped into the forest. It was a disaster for Saruman, and it demonstrated that for all their improvements, the Uruk-hai were not invincible. But the Uruk-hai's greatest trial came at the Battle of Helm's Deep, one of the pivotal battles of the War of the Ring. Saruman, enraged by his setbacks and determined to destroy Rohan once and for all, sent a vast army to attack the fortress of Helm's Deep, where the people of Rohan had taken refuge. The army was composed primarily of Uruk-hai, thousands of them, armed and armored for war. The battle began at night and raged through the darkness and into the dawn. The Uruk-hai attacked in waves, using ladders and siege equipment to assault the walls of the fortress. They were fearless, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades, pressing the attack even when it seemed hopeless. Their war cries filled the air, and their black banners with Saruman's white hand whipped in the wind. The defenders fought desperately, and the battle hung in the balance for hours. The Uruk-hai managed to breach the walls in several places, and vicious fighting raged in the courtyards and corridors of the fortress. It seemed for a time that they might actually win, that Saruman's creation might prove strong enough to overthrow the kingdom of Rohan. But then, at dawn, two things happened that turned the tide. First, Gandalf the White, who had been thought dead, appeared with reinforcements, a host of riders led by Eomer. Second, the Harns, the ancient tree-like beings of Fangorn Forest, arrived and surrounded the Uruk-hai army, driven by their hatred of all that Saruman had done to their forest. Caught between the charging cavalry and the Huorns, the Uruk-hai were destroyed. Those who tried to flee into the forest were caught by the trees and never seen again. Those who stood their ground were ridden down by the Rohirrim. By the time the sun was fully risen, Saruman's army was annihilated, and his power was broken. The few Uruk-hai who survived the battle fled back to Isengard, only to find that fortress also under siege. The Ents, the shepherds of the trees, had marched on Isengard and destroyed it, flooding it, tearing down its walls, breaking its war machines. Saruman himself was trapped in his tower, his power utterly broken, and so the experiment of the Uruk-hai came to an end. They had been formidable warriors, superior to common orcs in nearly every way, but they had not been enough. They had been defeated by the courage of men, by the intervention of the wizards, and by the wrath of nature itself rising against the corruption Saruman represented. After the fall of Saruman, the surviving Uruk-hai scattered. Some fled into the mountains, trying to join with other orc tribes, though they were often rejected or killed by their smaller cousins who resented their arrogance. Others wandered the wilderness, becoming bandits and raiders. But without Saruman to organize them, without his breeding programs to create more of their kind, they were a dead end, a failed experiment that would not outlast the war. The creation of the Uruk-hai represents perhaps the darkest aspect of the Orcs' story, the idea that the corruption that created Orcs in the first place could be refined, improved, made even more terrible. Saruman had taken Morgoth's ancient crime and tried to perfect it, and in doing so he had damned himself. His fall from grace was complete. From the greatest of the wizards to a petty tyrant ruling over ruins, hated and despised by all, the Uruk-hai, for all their strength, were ultimately just orcs, products of corruption and evil, doomed to serve darkness and to die in darkness. They were a reminder that evil, no matter how refined or improved, is still evil, and cannot stand against the light. Rest now, dear friends, for we approach the end of our tale. In our final chapter, we shall speak of the War of the Ring itself, of the last great battles of the Orcs, and of their ultimate fate when Sauron finally fell. But for tonight, sleep peacefully, knowing that even the most terrible creations of evil have limits, and can be overcome by courage and hope. Until tomorrow, when we conclude our journey. Welcome back, dear friends, for what will be our penultimate evening together on this journey through the history of the Orcs. Tonight, we speak of the War of the Ring. the great conflict that would determine the fate of Middle-earth and bring the long story of the Orcs to its climax. This was the war for which they had been preparing, knowingly or not, for thousands of years, and it would be their last. The War of the Ring began, in a sense, when a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins found a magic ring in the depths of the Misty Mountains, in the very tunnels where Orcs dwelt. That ring, though none knew it at the time, was the One Ring, the Master Ring that Sauron had forged in the Second Age, and that had been cut from his hand at the end of that age. Its findings set in motion events that would reshape the world. By the time the war truly began, Sauron had returned to Mordor in physical form. He had rebuilt Barad-dûr, had gathered vast armies, and was preparing to make his final bid for dominion over Middle-earth. And at the heart of his armies, as always, were the Orcs. The Orcs of Mordor in those final years numbered in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions. They filled the dark land from border to border, dwelling in camps and fortresses, in the caverns of the Ash Mountains, and in the tunnels beneath Barad-dûr itself. They came in many varieties, from the small, cowardly goblins to the large, fierce warriors. And among them were Sauron's own creations, Orcs that rivaled Saruman's Uruk-hai in size and strength. Sauron had spent centuries refining his Orc stock, breeding them for war. His Orcs were better organized than ever before, divided into regiments and legions, each with its own banners and commanders. They wore armor marked with the Eye of Sauron, his symbol of power and dominion. And they were driven not just by fear of their master, but by a kind of twisted faith in his ultimate victory. The Orcs believed that this time would be different. This time, they would win. Sauron was stronger than he had been in the last alliance. His enemies were weaker. The great elven kingdoms had faded, and most of the elves had left Middle-earth entirely. The kingdoms of men were shadows of their former glory. Even the dwarves had diminished, their greatest cities lost or abandoned. It seemed to the Orcs that victory was inevitable, that soon they would rule Middle-earth under their dark master. But they had not counted on the courage of the small and the humble, on hobbits and the choices they would make. The war had many fronts, many battles, and the Orcs fought in all of them. In the north, they attacked the Lonely Mountain and the city of Dale, besieging them with vast armies. In Mirkwood, they assailed the elven kingdom of Thranduil. In Rohan, as we have already discussed, they marched under Saruman's banner to Helm's Deep. And in the south, they prepared for the great assault on Minas Tirith, the last major city of Gondor. The siege of Minas Tirith was the greatest military operation the Orcs had mounted since the ancient wars of the First Age. Sauron gathered an army of staggering size, Orcs beyond counting, along with trolls and men from the south and east who served him. This host marched from Mordor and surrounded Minas Tirith, cutting it off from all aid. The Orcs attacked the city with all the skill and savagery they had developed over millennia of warfare. They brought siege towers and battering rams, catapults that hurled burning projectiles, and later they brought the Witch King himself, the Lord of the Nazgul, to break the gates with his sorcery. The defenders of Minas Tirith fought bravely, but they were vastly outnumbered. The orcs came in waves, using ladders to scale the walls, pouring through breaches, fighting in the streets. It seemed that the city must fall, that the last great stronghold of men would be overrun by the dark tide. But then came the riders of Rohan, arriving at dawn on the fields outside the city. They had ridden through the night to bring aid to Gondor, and they charged into the orc army with devastating effect. The orcs who had been focused on the siege were caught unprepared. The cavalry charge shattered their formations, and panic began to spread through their ranks. This was the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, and it was catastrophic for the orcs. They fought desperately, trying to rally, trying to stem the tide of charging horsemen, but the Rohirrim were filled with battle fury, and they cut through the orc ranks like a scythe through wheat. Then came more reinforcements. The army of the dead summoned by Aragorn, and the southern forces of Gondor arriving by ship. The orcs broke. It was not a retreat, not an organized withdrawal, but a rout. They fled in all directions, trampling each other in their panic, throwing down their weapons, thinking only of escape. The allied forces pursued them, cutting them down by the thousands. The fields outside Minas Tirith became a charnel house carpeted with orc corpses. But the war was not over. The forces of the West, led by Aragorn and Gandalf, made a desperate decision. They would march on the Black Gate of Mordor itself to draw Sauron's attention away from Frodo the Ring-Bearer, who was secretly making his way into Mordor to destroy the One Ring. The army that marched to the Black Gate was small, only a few thousand warriors, but they represented the last hope of the free peoples, and they marched with courage, if not with confidence. When they reached the Black Gate and challenged Sauron, the Dark Lord responded by opening the gate and sending forth an army that dwarfed the small force arrayed against him. The orcs poured out of Mordor in numbers beyond counting. They surrounded the army of the West, cutting off all escape. And then they attacked, wave after wave, trying to overwhelm the defenders through sheer weight of numbers. The fighting was desperate and brutal, and it seemed certain that the army of the West would be annihilated. But then, at the moment of greatest peril, everything changed. Frodo, deep within Mordor, had reached Mount Doom and cast the One Ring into the fires. The ring was destroyed, and with it, Sauron's power. The effect on the orcs was immediate and catastrophic. They had been driven forward by Sauron's will, animated by his power, held together by his dominion over them. When that power was suddenly cut off, when Sauron's spirit was scattered to the winds, the orcs lost all direction, all purpose. Some simply stopped fighting, standing in confusion, unable to understand what had happened. Others went mad, attacking anything near them, orc and enemy alike. Most broke and ran, fleeing in terror toward Mordor, or into the mountains, or in any direction that seemed to offer escape. The armies of the West, who had been moments from destruction, found themselves suddenly unopposed. They pursued the fleeing orcs, cutting down many, but letting others escape in the chaos. And then, as they watched, the earth itself seemed to rebel against Sauron's realm. Earthquakes shook Mordor. Mount Doom erupted. Barad-dûr, the dark tower that had stood for thousands of years collapsed in ruin. The orcs who had fled back into Mordor found themselves trapped in a land that was literally tearing itself apart. The ground opened beneath them. Rivers of lava flowed across the plains. The mountains trembled and fell. Thousands upon thousands of orcs perished in the destruction of Mordor, buried beneath falling rocks, consumed by fire, drowned in the chaos. Those orcs who escaped Mordor scattered to the four winds. Some fled north back to the misty mountains and their old strongholds. Others went east or south into the wild lands where they might hide. But they were hunted now, hunted with a determination that the free peoples had never shown before. For the first time in the history of Middle-earth, there was a coordinated effort to exterminate the orcs entirely. The kingdoms of men, the elven realms, the dwarven halls, all united in this purpose. They sent armies into the mountains to root out orc strongholds. They scoured the wilderness for orc bands. They showed no mercy, for there could be no mercy for creatures that had been the instruments of so much evil. Moria was finally cleared of orcs by a dwarven army that marched from the Iron Hills. The orcs there, leaderless and demoralized, put up little resistance. Gundabad in the north was besieged and taken, its orc population slaughtered or scattered. Stronghold after stronghold fell, and the orc population of Middle-earth was reduced drastically. But as we know from the history we have traced through these many evenings, orcs are survivors. Despite the hunting, despite the massacres, some survived. They hid in the deepest caves, the most remote wildernesses. They went to ground like animals and waited for the storm to pass. What happened to these surviving orcs is not entirely clear. The historical records of Middle-earth focus on the great events, on the deeds of heroes and the rise and fall of kingdoms. The fate of scattered bands of orcs hiding in mountain caves did not merit much attention from the chroniclers. Some scholars believe that the orcs eventually died out entirely, that without a dark power to organize them and give them purpose, they could not maintain their numbers. Orcs were always more numerous when serving a master, when breeding programs were managed, and resources were directed toward creating more warriors. Left to their own devices, constantly hunted, unable to establish secure territories, the orcs might simply have faded away over the generations following the War of the Ring. Others believe that some orcs survived, that their descendants might still lurk in the deep places of the world, diminished and scattered, but enduring as they always had. These orcs, if they exist, would be primitive, isolated, more like the bandits and raiders of the early Third Age than the organized armies of Sauron's time. What we do know is that the orcs as a significant military and political force were finished. Never again would they march in vast armies. Never again would they threaten kingdoms and conquer lands. The age of the orcs, which had lasted for thousands of years, from the depths of the First Age to the end of the Third, was over. Their legacy, however, remained. The scars they left on the world, the destruction they caused, the suffering they inflicted, all of this would be remembered for generations. The orcs had been the foot soldiers of evil, the instruments through which dark lords had waged war against the light. And in their defeat, in their final scattering, There was a sort of justice, however grim. The War of the Ring marked the end of an age, not just for the Orcs, but for Middle-earth itself. The elves began their final departure for the Undying Lands. The age of magic and wonder was fading, giving way to the age of men. And in this new age there was no place for creatures like the orcs born of ancient evil tied to powers that no longer existed. And so the orcs passed from history into legend, from reality into nightmare, becoming stories told to frighten children, warnings about the dangers of darkness and corruption. But for those who had lived through the war, who had fought against the orc hordes, the memory was more vivid and more terrible. Rest now, dear friends, for we have one more chapter to share, a final reflection on what the orcs meant, what they represented, and what lessons we can draw from their long and terrible history. But the story of their wars, their battles, their rise and fall is now complete. Sleep well, and know that even the darkest night must eventually end, and that dawn always comes, no matter how long we must wait for it. Welcome back, dear friends, for our final evening together on this long journey through the history of the orcs. We have traveled far, from the elder days when the world was young, through ages of war and suffering, to the final defeat of darkness at the end of the Third Age. Tonight, we do not speak of battles or of dark lords, but of deeper questions of meaning and legacy, and of what the orcs represent in the grand tapestry of Middle-earth's history. Let us begin with a question that troubled even the great minds of that world, a question that Tolkien himself, the chronicler of these tales, wrestled with throughout his life. Were the orcs truly evil? Could they be held responsible for their actions? Or were they merely victims corrupted against their will and forced to serve darkness? This is not a simple question, and it deserves thoughtful consideration. The orcs, as we have learned, were created through the corruption of elves, the firstborn children of creation. They did not choose to be what they were. They were made into monsters through torture and sorcery, through generations of abuse and indoctrination. In this sense, they were victims, the ultimate victims, perhaps, of Morgoth's evil. Yet the orcs as we encounter them in the stories are undeniably cruel and malicious. They delight in causing pain. They kill and destroy without remorse. They serve evil willingly, or at least without apparent resistance. Can we excuse their actions simply because they were born into darkness? Is there not, in every thinking being, some spark of choice, some ability to choose good over evil? Tolkien himself was uncertain about this. In his letters and his notes, we see him grappling with the theological implications of the orcs. He believed, as a matter of faith, that evil could not create, only corrupt. This meant that the orcs must have had their origin in something good, something created by the One. But if they were corrupted beyond any hope of redemption, if they had no choice but to be evil, then were they not simply puppets? And if so, how could they be held accountable? Some of Tolkien's writings suggest that perhaps not all orcs were irredeemable, that perhaps some, given the chance, might have turned from evil. But we see no examples of this in the stories. Every orc we encounter is cruel, vicious, serving darkness. If there were good orcs or orcs struggling against their nature, their stories were not told. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. The orcs were victims of their creation, yes, but they were also perpetrators of countless evils. They were both corrupted and corrupters, both slaves and willing servants. They existed in a moral gray area that makes us uncomfortable because it challenges our desire for clear categories of good and evil. But let us consider what the orcs represent symbolically in the larger mythology of Middle-earth. They are, in many ways, the embodiment of industrialized evil, of corruption that has become systematic and self-perpetuating. They represent what happens when cruelty becomes normalized, when entire populations are raised to believe that violence and domination are not just acceptable but desirable. In this sense, the orcs serve as a warning. They show us the ultimate end result of systems built on oppression and fear. They demonstrate how evil, given enough time and power, can corrupt not just individuals but entire cultures, creating societies where kindness is weakness and mercy is foolishness. The orcs' strongholds, with their breeding pits and their constant competition for dominance, are nightmares of social organization, hierarchies of suffering, where everyone is both victim and victimizer. The orcs also represent the cost of war, the expendable masses who die in service to the ambitions of powers they can barely comprehend. Throughout the ages, orcs died by the millions, thrown into battles they could not win, sacrificed for goals that would not benefit them even if achieved. They were used, discarded, replaced, an endless supply of cannon fodder for dark lords who cared nothing for their individual lives or suffering. There is a tragedy in this that goes beyond the orcs themselves. The tragedy is that such a system could exist at all, that thinking, feeling beings could be reduced to mere instruments of destruction. The orcs remind us that evil is not just about individual bad choices, but about systems and structures that create and perpetuate suffering on massive scales. Yet we must also acknowledge that the orcs, for all their tragic origins, were genuinely dangerous. They could not be reasoned with, could not be redeemed through gentle words or kind treatment. They killed and destroyed wherever they went, and those who opposed darkness had no choice but to fight against them. The heroes of Middle-earth did not hunt orcs out of cruelty or hatred, but out of necessity, to protect the innocent and preserve what was good in the world. This brings us to another important aspect of the orc legacy, what they teach us about the nature of good and evil. The free peoples of Middle-earth, the elves and men and dwarves and hobbits, were not perfect. They had their flaws, their conflicts, their moments of weakness and failure, but they had something the orcs did not: the ability to choose, to grow, to change. They could be brave or cowardly, kind or cruel, wise or foolish, but these were choices they made, not nature they were born into. The contrast between the free peoples and the orcs highlights what makes a being truly free. It is not just the absence of a master, though the orcs certainly had those. It is the presence of genuine choice, the ability to determine one's own path, to create a meaning in one's existence. The orcs, even when masterless, were never truly free because they were trapped in patterns of thought and behavior that had been beaten into them over generations. As we reflect on the long history of the orcs, from their terrible birth in Utumno to their final scattering at the end of the Third Age, we see a pattern repeating itself. The orcs served evil. They fought against good. They were defeated. They scattered. They endured. They gathered again under a new master, and the cycle repeated. This happened after Morgoth's fall, after Sauron's first defeat, after his second defeat. Each time, it seemed the orcs might be finally eliminated, and each time, they survived. What does this persistence tell us? Perhaps it suggests that evil, once introduced into the world, cannot be entirely eliminated. It can be defeated, contained, reduced, but some remnant always remains, waiting for the opportunity to grow again. The orcs were Morgoth's lasting curse upon Middle-earth, a corruption that could not be fully cleansed. But there is another way to look at it. The fact that the orcs could be defeated again and again, that their armies could be scattered and their strongholds destroyed, this tells us that evil, for all its power, is not invincible. It can be opposed, fought against, overcome. Each victory against the darkness, even if temporary, was still a victory. Still a triumph of courage and hope over despair and domination. The heroes who fought against the orcs, from the elven lords of the First Age to the hobbits of the Third, did not fight because they believed they could create a perfect world free from all evil. They fought because it was right to fight, because the alternative, submission to darkness, was unacceptable. They fought to protect what they loved, to preserve what was good, to ensure that future generations would have the chance to live in light rather than shadow. And in the end, they succeeded. The Third Age ended with the defeat of Sauron and the scattering of his orc armies. Middle-earth entered a new age, an age of men, an age where the old magics faded and the world became more ordinary, less touched by the supernatural powers that had shaped the earlier ages. In this new age, there was no place for orcs, creatures so tied to the ancient evils that their very existence depended on dark powers. What lessons can we take from the long and terrible history of the orcs? Perhaps the most important is this, that corruption, while powerful, is not natural. The orcs were not created evil. They were made evil through suffering and indoctrination. This suggests that goodness is the natural state, the original condition, and that evil requires constant effort to maintain. We might also learn about the importance of resistance to evil, of standing firm against darkness even when the odds seem overwhelming. The free peoples of Middle-earth fought against the orcs for thousands of years, suffering countless defeats, losing great kingdoms and beloved heroes, but they never gave up, never surrendered, and eventually they prevailed. And perhaps we can learn something about mercy and judgment as well. The orcs were pitiful in their way, tragic creatures who'd never asked to be what they were, yet they were also dangerous, genuinely evil in their actions, if not in their origins. The free peoples had to fight against them, had to defeat them. But perhaps there is room for sorrow as well. Sorrow for what the Orcs might have been if Morgoth had never corrupted the first elves, if that original evil had never entered the world. As we close our long journey through Orc history, let us remember that these are, in the end, stories meant to illuminate truth about our own world. We may not have orcs in our reality, but we have systems of oppression, cycles of violence, corruptions that seem impossible to fully eliminate. The challenges faced by the peoples of Middle-earth mirror, in symbolic form, the challenges we face in our own lives and societies. The story of the Orcs reminds us to be vigilant against the corruption of good into evil, to recognize when systems are creating suffering rather than alleviating it, to stand against cruelty and domination wherever we find them. It reminds us that evil is not inevitable, that it can be fought and defeated, even if the victory is never final, even if the struggle must be taken up anew by each generation. And so, dear friends, we come to the end of our tale. The Orcs, those dark children of Morgoth, those corrupted elves who became instruments of evil, have played their role in the great drama of Middle-earth. They were villains, yes, but also victims. They were enemies, but also warnings. They were defeated, but their memory endures. A reminder of the eternal struggle between light and darkness, between freedom and tyranny, between hope and despair. As you prepare for sleep tonight, let go of the darkness we have explored together. Remember instead the heroes who stood against it, the courage that defeated it, the hope that endured through all the long ages of struggle. Remember that even the deepest shadow cannot withstand the dawn, and that goodness, though challenged, can never be entirely overcome. Sleep peacefully, dear listeners. Dream of starlight and green hills, of brave hearts and kind deeds, of a world where darkness has been defeated and the age of peace has begun. And when you wake, carry with you the lessons of our journey, the understanding that evil can be opposed, that courage matters, and that even in the darkest times, there is always hope. Thank you for walking this long road with me, through shadow and back into light. May your rest be deep and your dreams be sweet. Until we meet again in other stories, at other firesides, I bid you good night and farewell.